Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to this week's discussion for Information Studies 650, Arrangement and Description, Leaves on the Archival Tree. So I always think of arrangement and description as taking a set of records and pruning them and shaping them in a particular way that almost results in a sculpture, much like a bonsai tree. So kind of pruning leaves off of different branches and shaping leaves in different ways. And then that shape or that tree is what the researcher sees when they are working with the collection that results from the arrangement and description that archivists engage in. So we'll start by looking at our weekly topics for this week. We'll be talking about what is arrangement and description, what is the concept of more product, less process, and what are its strengths and weaknesses, and what role does an archivist play in arrangement and description, and how does this role impact the researcher? So we'll be looking at all 5 of our course learning objectives during this lecture. Okay, we'll start by bringing up some definitions of arrangement and description from the essay Glossary of Archival and Records Terminology. Just a few things that I have highlighted here. So arrangement is done in order to protect the context and achieve physical or intellectual control over the materials. So here again, we have an emphasis on context, making sure that records that are related to each other are contextually linked in the arrangement of the collection, whether that's because they're in the same series within a fine aid, or that relationship is made clear in other ways. Okay, and then we have description, which is in part done to facilitate the works or the collection of records identification, management, and understanding. So with description, you're really taking a giant mass of records and you're labeling what those records are. So you're identifying them, you're providing a way for them to be managed and interacted with, and through that process, you're increasing an understanding of the content and context of the records that a researcher is looking at. So arrangement and description fundamentally are focused on use. So processing is really kind of a broad term for arrangement and description, and use is an important part of these two processes. It really is the point of these processes to make a giant mass of collections which may have very little structure, may have very little information readily apparent about the records, and mediating, again we have this word mediation, to provide structure, to provide context, to identify the records and make them more usable for researchers. So to talk a little bit more about how arrangement and description fits in with the traditional life cycle of the record, so one that we've looked at a few times already in this course, we have arrangement and description here in the now you're cooking stage. So this is oftentimes the first major intervention or mediation that archivists have once the records have been determined to be archival and they're brought into the repository. So there might be some initial description done to the records when the records are accessioned, which is something that we touched on last week when we discussed appraisal. But arrangement and description is where the records are really described and arranged to a more thorough level. And how that process plays out and what form that process takes can really have a lot of impact on different activities that archivists engage in. So for instance, if records are arranged and described very well, then it's easier for reference archivists to use them because They have a lot of descriptive information about the records represented in the form of a finding aid, which we'll touch on this week and more later on in this course. And they're able to provide information to researchers in a much more efficient and effective manner. Online access can certainly be improved by increased arrangement and description as well. So just having more information about what the records are, and that can be passed on to researchers in an online format. Okay. So again, generally speaking, arrangement and description organizes records, it structures records, it describes records, and it puts records in context. So you might have a collection that resembles, this really cluttered and unkept room, and then through this act of organization and structure and description and providing context to the records, you just put everything in a nice, neat, precise, descriptive output that researchers can go and consult when they want to learn more about a set of records. So rather than having information that might be related kind of scattered around and not really contextually or organizationally linked together, you have like information linked with information that it's related to, and that just makes the relationships and the connections between records much more apparent to researchers. So it's much easier to find something in a room that looks like this and understand how different items are related to each other in a room like this than in a room like this where things are just kind of thrown around and scattered. So some collections, when they come in, may look like this. They may be really messy and not really have any apparent order to them at all. Some collections may come in actually in pretty good shape. And that's related to original order, which is something that we'll talk about here in just a minute. So a couple of other things that arrangement and description does is it works to preserve and support authenticity. And so this is something that especially the McNeil article that we read for this week talks about. So authenticity oftentimes is linked to the idea of provenance. And according to the McNeil article on page 271, provenance states that records created by one creator should not be mixed with records of another creator. So if I have a set of collections or a set of records, and there is another set of records that might be related to other, staff or faculty in the School of Information Studies, provenance would say that my records should be separate from these other records, even though they might have things in common. My records should be identified as my records, and if something is saying these are the papers or records of Sean Hayes, then only my records should be contained within that collection. And there shouldn't be records from Dr. Force or Rebecca Hall or anyone else that so is kind of folded in. And there are a lot of ways that the idea of provenance can be undermined. And some of them that we've talked about before when we have discussed some of the different types of curatorship that influence the shape of collections. So for instance, if I have a set of papers and then heaven forbid I pass on, and my wife or my daughter go through them and they say, wow, we're really not comfortable with this information ending up in an archive, so we're just going to take it out, or we're going to shape things so it looks like something happened to Sean that's different from something else from what really happened to Sean, then that can create some authenticity issues, and it can really affect the provenance of my records, because if a person shapes my collection, then they are essentially creating the record, and the records are no longer really a collection of my papers. They're a collection of my papers as interpreted and shaped by someone else. And so more current archival thought suggests that the people that may have made some of these decisions should really be recorded, or researchers should just be aware of this shaping in some way. And that can really extend to archivists as well, because as we've talked about, archivists can make a lot of decisions about collections, and they can remove things from collections, and they can describe things in particular ways. So there really is more of a push to make people aware of that role, and that's something that we'll touch on later. One way that archivists can really support the idea of authenticity is by retaining the original order of records, so the original order that the collection came in, and not taking things that came in one box and putting them in another box for whatever reason. Maybe an archivist feels like it makes more sense for materials to be rearranged, or it's helpful for the researchers to rearrange records, but that really can undermine this idea of original order, because again, it involves someone having a mediative role and shaping the collection, which can again really undermine the record's authenticity and undermine the sense of one person as being the provenance of records. So there really is a lot of connection between authenticity and original order. Oftentimes this is inevitable. Sometimes records will come in, or a person's collection will come in, and it'll just be a mess. There won't be any order to the records at all. It looks like people just kind of dump things into a box or threw a bunch of things on a hard drive and said, okay, here you go. And while retaining that original order is the most authentic way to provide access to the records and to portray the records through arrangement description, oftentimes it's not the representation of the records that is most useful for researchers. And so archivists have to mediate to take different steps to make what might be a mass of disorganized records more useful for researchers and the archivists themselves, frankly, to use. So again, there's this whole idea of a curator produces records, provenance determines who created what, and again, provenance can be kind of a mixed and sticky term. The original order of the records demonstrates how the records were used, and the authenticity of a records is derived from the provenance and original order. And processing should preserve this as much as possible by not mixing records, or again, not rearranging records just for random reasons. And so arrangement and description really should be careful to recognize these pretty traditional and ingrained archival concepts. Again, there are some challenges to both of them, but generally speaking, these are a couple of theories or standards that archives try to adhere to when arranging and describing records as much as possible. Sometimes you get artificial collections that really are a mash of records that were created by a bunch of different people. So the University of Wyoming's American Heritage Center has the Forrest J. Ackerman papers, which is a great collection, but really it's a mix of science fiction materials that Ackerman obtained from different people throughout his life. So a bunch of science fiction posters, B-movie posters, and things like that. So that's what you would call a mixed collection or an artificial collection. And it's not really considered to be as authentic as a whole as other collections that just have one single provenance and have some kind of original order to them. Another thing that arrangement and description needs to do is it needs to describe or represent in some way the whole picture of a person's life or of an organization's activity. So it needs to portray all the different functions that a person or an organization was engaged in. Of course, this can be problematic because not all of the functions of a person's life or of an organization are represented in archives. So maybe at some point the records that documented this function were destroyed, or an archivist decided that this function wasn't important enough to document during the appraisal stage, and so those records weren't included with the other records that were brought into the archive. However, archivists are still responsible for representing in some way the whole picture of an organization or of a person's life. And so arrangement and description, especially things like the scope and content of a finding aid, the biography or history section of a finding aid, really can make people aware of different functions or different parts of a person's life that aren't necessarily represented in the records that they're looking at. And that can be really important because if people see that only certain functions are represented in a collection, then they may feel that those were the only functions that a person was involved with or that an organization carried out. Or they may feel that the functions that are represented are the most important functions, and anything else that an organization did or a person did aren't important, because if it was important, it would be in the archive, right? But again, there are a lot of things that could cause these records not to be in the archive. There could have been a fire, there could have been a server that, melted down, or a whole bunch of different reasons that aren't related to the importance of records at all. So if archivists, through arrangement and description, don't indicate to researchers that what they're looking at is just a fragment of a whole universe of records that exists out there, they may get an inaccurate or incomplete understanding of a person or an organization. And that can really influence what they use archival records to produce. So they may write a book that doesn't really take into consideration things that weren't represented in an archive if an archive doesn't say, oh, and by the way, this person also did this, but it's not, these records aren't in this collection. So it's really important for archives to indicate through arrangement and description not only what is in a collection, but also what isn't in a collection as well. The Laura Miller chapter for this week had some really great steps for describing archives. So first, researching and writing an account of the nature and scope of the archives and the record's creator. So again, writing this scope, not just of the archives, but of the record's creator as a whole, is a good opportunity to provide some of the missing information that I just touched on. You can say, okay, here is what's in the archive, and here is what the record's creator did. And by the way, we don't have records related to, this and this and this. So again, you're just presenting a researcher with a more complete idea of what activities and what functions a person or an organization was involved with. A part of arrangement and description is capturing descriptive elements such as date, extent, physical condition, and restrictions, among others. So making sure that you are providing to researchers information like what date span is a collection, what date span is a particular box or a particular folder, how large is the collection, what's the physical condition of the collection, so what kind of formats are the records on, and any restrictions that might be attached to the record. So that there may be an indication that some of the records are restricted or unavailable for various reasons. Another thing that archivists engage in through arrangement and description is to create access points to help researchers determine which archives are relevant to their research. So nice little subject headings that a researcher can click on in a finding aid, and that will bring up collections that also have the same subject heading. So again, this idea of description as a way to provide context. Subject headings can be a great way to provide context for records and demonstrate that they are related to other records that the archive may have, or even records that another archive might have, if an archive is feeling truly charitable and I guess kind of cutting edge. And finally, presenting the information that I described above in some kind of descriptive tool, such as a finding aid, that again facilitates the understanding of the content and context of a set of records. So making this information that Miller listed above as widely available as possible. Now, as we'll talk about later on in the semester, there are a lot of things about finding aids that aren't intuitive and can make it difficult for researchers to understand the content of records. But at least the ideal is that descriptive tools like finding aids or online collections are helpful and facilitate research, as opposed to just kind of confusing people and making them want to run away. So again, we've talked a lot about mediation in this course, and all these are mediations. So the archivist chooses what to include and the nature and scope of the collection. The archivist chooses how to describe the record's creator or creators and their activities. The archivist chooses how to describe the dates, the extent, the physical condition, and so on. The archivist chooses which access points to use. So these are all choices by archivists that can shape the meaning and understanding of a collection of records that researchers get when they interact with a particular collection. So oftentimes the choices that archivists make when doing these things really can shape how people understand the records that they're looking at. So finding aids are human creations, at least for now. They are things that are written and created by people, and the choices that make up these artificial constructions, are choices made by individuals. And so again, it just goes back to archivists playing a creative role in how records are perceived and used. And that can have a lot of influence on social memory. If archivists don't include something that may be in the collection in a description of the scope of the collection, then researchers may not think that information about a particular topic is attached to a collection. If archivists don't include information about something that a record's creator was engaged in, then a researcher may think that, okay, well, this person was involved with this after all. So again, these mediative choices can just have a strong influence on social memory. To talk a little bit more about arrangement and description, and especially description, again, we have McNeil talking about the stabilization of relationships among records as they enter archival custody. And again, this authenticity attestation that occurs when records come into archives. So when a record comes into an archive, people just kind of assume that an archivist has really looked into the authenticity of the records, and that what they're looking at is what it says on the tin, that if a collection says so-and-so's papers, then it's only so-and-so's papers that are going to be in those records, and not the records of, their cousin, or, also the correspondence of, their friend from the Jersey Shore or wherever. Another thing that McNeil really promotes is the idea of description indicating the archival role in shaping the understanding of the records being described. And again, this idea that description involves conscious and deliberate decisions about how archival documents are represented. So it really goes back to the idea of transparency. So we talked about archivists being transparent with their appraisal decisions earlier on in this course, and McNeil argues, and I would agree strongly, that it's important for archivists to be transparent about what decisions they made when arranging and describing records. So why did they choose to describe records in a particular way? Why did they decide to take the original order of records and change it? Why did they use particular subject access terms? So this just gives the researcher more of an understanding of the mediative role that archivists have played. One interesting thing that McNeil touches on is the instability of description and how description may change over time as archivists revisit finding aids. And she ties this overhauling of finding aids to new standards and concepts of arrangement. I think that you can really tie it to some of the reactivations that we've talked about. So it could be a situation where records are described in a particular way and a researcher uses the collection and does research with the collection, or maybe they're an expert in the field that the collection is related to, and they can say, oh, archivist, you got this wrong. This is actually what this box is about, or the dates for these letters in this box are different from what you have on here. And then archivists can go back and change the finding aid to reflect this different input from researchers or people using the records. Also, as records are reactivated and used for different purposes, that may impact how they're described over time as well. And so McNeil describes description as something that may consist of multiple defining moments. So not just this situation where records are described in one way when they enter into the archive, but rather records that are described in different ways over time as society changes, as an understanding of records changes, as an understanding of the content and context of records changes because the records are being used. And this really goes back to a more continuum-y idea of arrangement and description. So not something that occurs just in a finite stage in the life of a record, but something that is continuously occurring, and that the arrangement and description of records can continuously evolve or continuously be reactivated, to use a term that we've discussed a fair amount in this class. So it's really important that archivists are aware that records are arranged and described before they even come into a repository. When records are created, say an electronic records management system, metadata is attached to those records, and that is descriptive information about the record itself. When it was created, who created it, the size of the record, and so on. So some of the things that we talked about arrangement description really needs to convey. And so it really is important for this descriptive information to be captured as soon after the creation of the record as possible and be sustained and attached to the record throughout its life. And again, that's really going to be useful for archivists because they'll have more of an understanding of the contents of the record and how the record was used and all this other rich contextual knowledge that we've talked about. So similar to archivists engaging in appraisal when as close to the creation of a record as possible, it's also important for archivists to think about the description, especially attached to the record as soon after its creation, and hopefully working to make sure that the descriptive information is rich and that it survives until the record ends up in an archive. To talk a little bit more about description, the Green and Meisner article for this week talks about how description should do three things. It should represent the context of the record. So again, the who, what, where, when, and why, how the records are related to each other. The physical characteristics of the record, which is something that we touched on. The format of the record. Is it a diary? Is it a floppy disk? And things like that. And the informational content of the record. So what is actually represented in the record? Is it a picture of someone's dog? Is it someone's diary? And so on. And so again, a lot of this information can be represented in metadata. And so again, that's why it's so important for archivists to have good metadata to work with, and why it's so helpful for archivists to work with records creators to make sure that it is attached to records over time. So MPLP, or more product, less process, would argue that the most general level of description that does this to a collection is the most appropriate unless the materials are exceptionally important. So if you can provide this information to researchers while doing very little descriptive work, then that's good enough, unless there are some factors that compel you to dig deeper and to provide more information or more in-depth description than you would otherwise. And we'll talk about some of the factors that might lead to more involved levels of description later on in this lecture. So to talk a little bit more about MPLP, what's interesting about the MPLP article is that while it's focused on description in a lot of ways, in some ways it's also a preservation article. So it kind of straddles the line of a couple of different archival topics. So MPLP really advocates for processing that expedites getting collection materials into the hands of researchers. So it really emphasizes access over depth of description. And that really focuses on the first point here being brief and concise, not spending a ton of time describing things, just be concise and get materials into the hands of researchers. It supports describing materials to an adequate level and describing materials to a level sufficient for use. And again, it starts with it's premised on the idea that you should start out more general and get more specific as situations warrant. I touched on how MPLP is focused on preservation as well as processing, and it really is focused on providing the minimal steps to preserve records and not focusing on doing item level preservation by doing things such as removing paper clips and staples and so on. It really says just get things out there and get them into the hands of researchers. And it mostly relies on climate control as a preservation tool. So really kind of broad general preservation in addition to broad and general description. So there are some real tensions here. There are some tensions between serving users and researchers and protecting and describing the context of records. So if your description is brief and concise, then you may not be providing a lot of useful descriptive information for researchers to use. So sure, the researchers may be able to access the materials more quickly because you haven't spent a lot of time processing the collection, but they may have to spend more time hunting down the information that they want because the archivist hasn't really done a great job of providing that information to them through their description. And there's also a real tension between privacy and granting access to unprocessed records, or even records that have been sort of minimally processed. So anytime you're not spending a lot of effort into working with records and getting to know what's in a collection, that increases the risk that you are going to provide access to materials that may have private information that is going to be shared with whoever looks at a particular collection. So there really is a tension between getting stuff in front of researchers and protecting the privacy of people represented within archival records. A couple of these other terms are pretty problematic. So describing materials to an adequate level. So what's adequate is really going to differ from researcher to researcher and from the needs that different researchers have. Some people may need materials described really deeply because they're trying to do research for a book or a thesis. Other people might just need really basic information because they're doing a paper or a quick presentation and it doesn't really require a lot of effort. Describing materials at levels sufficient for use. Again, what is sufficient for use is really going to vary from person to person. So those are some pretty problematic premises to base arrangement and description on. Another issue that a lot of archivists have about preservation is the reliance on climate control for preservation. Not every archive has a climate controlled storage to put records in. So that may make paper clips and other things kind of rusting and degrading over time more of an issue, because if records are in climate that isn't controlled, then things will rust faster, the records will decay faster, and that can be a problem for the records over time. So if you're not spending a lot of time working with records and looking through the records because you're doing MPLP, then you might not be aware of different preservation issues that are going on. You might not be aware that there's film in a film canister that is degrading. You might not be aware that there are photographs that are fading or have some kind of mold on them or something. So in a lot of ways, there is a contrast between quick and minimal processing and the long-term and adequate preservation of records, as well as between minimal processing and providing information to researchers in an efficient manner. So next, we'll talk about some of the different levels of MPLP. So first, we have collection level, represented by the humble amoeba here. Next, we have series level description, represented by the fly. So a little bit more evolved, but still pretty primitive. Following that, we have box level description. So quite a bit more evolved, represented by this adorable little kitten. Next, we have folder level description, which is really fairly advanced and evolved. So represented by this crying toddler. And then last, we have item level description, represented by really the pinnacle of humanity, Aaron Rodgers, the quarterback of the Green Bay Packers. And so we're going to go through all these different levels, and I'll show you some examples of what they look like and some of the pros and cons of these different levels of description. So we'll start by collection level description. So this is a level of description where very basic information about the collection is provided to the researchers. So really a broad kind of bird's eye view, a very undetailed view, a very vague view of what contents are in a collection. So some pros, this can be described very quickly. Oftentimes the description can be done from initial accession data, and very few resources are involved with this type of description. There are some cons though. If a collection is described at the collection level, it can be very difficult for researchers and reference staff to find the information that they're looking for, and reference staff may spend the time saved on description finding collection materials for researchers. So your processing archivist may be happy because, hey, I processed 3 collections last week, but when your reference archivists have to go through materials that are described very vaguely in order to help researchers find what they're looking for, the resources that you save in one way are going to be squandered in another. And you're probably going to have researchers that aren't very happy because it's taking forever for their reference requests to get answered. So this is a collection from the New York Public Library Archives and Manuscripts. So this is the Samuel L. Tilden papers. So collection level description would look like this. There'd be very general information about the collection. So again, some physical description, the number of linear feet, boxes and volumes, and so on, the creator, and then there might be a really brief kind of abstract that generally describes the subject of the records and what the papers consist of. So legal and political career stuff, correspondence, legal and political files, and so on. So really vague information. You know, you kind of have a general idea of what's in the collection, but you know, just based on this information, if you're looking for something specific, then it's really going to be difficult for you to tell what those or where that information might be located. Next, we'll talk about series level description. So this is when the collection is described at a series or subseries level. So it's a little bit more advanced and evolved than collection level description, but in a lot of ways it still leaves a lot to be desired. So again, some pros: it can be done fairly quickly, and it does use fewer resources than more detailed description. But again, you're kind of passing the buck off to your researchers and reference staff and making them spend more time and effort to find what they want. So here's an example again from the Tilden papers of what series level description would look like. So you would have the information before, and then you would just have a little bit more of an idea of how the information was broken down, and a little bit more specifics about what type of information is contained within the collection. So you would know, okay, there's correspondence within the collection, and just get a general idea of what is included in the correspondence. You would know that there are some materials about the counsel of the corporation, that there were legal files, and generally how many legal files there were. So a little bit more detailed information, but still you don't know what's in each of these 35 boxes. You don't know what's in each of these 20 boxes. And if you think of a box as possibly consisting of, you know, dozens and dozens of folders or thousands and thousands of documents, you're still kind of hunting for a needle in a haystack. And there may be sub-series as well. So we have series 1, correspondence, and then it's broken down into different sub-series. So within the correspondence, there's a sub-series just of correspondence related to his family, to the Tweed ring, to his gubernatorial term, and to more generally subject files. So again, it's a lot more useful than collection level description, but still can result in a lot of effort on behalf of your staff and archivists, or staff and researchers. So next we have box level description. So this is where the contents of each box in the collection is described, but not the content of each folder or each individual item. So some pros: not necessarily a large time commitment in small to mid-sized collections. It does provide a suitably efficient level of description for researchers and staff, and it can be applied to a broad cross-section of collection material. So if something is unimportant, you still might do box level description. If something is important, you can still do box level description and say, that's pretty good. Some cons: if you're working with a very large collection, it can still be, a lot of time spent on describing each box. If a collection has 500 boxes, then you know, it can take a long time to describe each one of those boxes, and it can still be rather broad for researchers seeking specific information. So if someone is looking for one letter in a box, you know, that still may be hundreds and hundreds of documents that they have to look through. So here's an example of box level description from the Robert Block papers at the University of Wyoming's American Heritage Center. Block was a horror and science fiction writer, so we see we have box 36, and then it tells you that it has correspondence that is undated and is also from 1955 to 1974 in it. So again, you can just kind of go through a box fairly quickly, find out what type of material is in it. the general dates for that material, and then just move on to the next box. And if a researcher was saying, okay, I'm interested in a letter that someone might have written to Block, from 1965 or maybe 1966, then you can narrow it down to a few different boxes here, and it's certainly more efficient than having to wade through a whole series or subseries or entire collection. Okay, so next I'll talk about folder level description. So this is where the contents of each folder in the collection are described, but not individual items. As you can imagine, this provides an exceptional amount of detail for researchers, and it's certainly less work for reference staff. You can just go look through FindAid, bing, there's a folder title or a folder description, and I'm fairly confident that what the researcher is looking for is in this folder. Of course, some cons: this can be very labor intensive, especially if you are doing it for a large collection or even substantial parts of smaller collections. And it can be pretty specific about what kinds of materials you're going to want to provide this level of description for. So you're going to reserve it for more important material, and it's not really as applicable to material that isn't considered to be as important for researchers. Okay, so here would be an example of folder level description from the Tilden papers. So you can see here we have our series, we have our subseries, we have our box, so this is box 1, and then folder 1. And we know that correspondence between Tilden and Henrietta Barnes is in box 1, folder 1. We even have some nice dates. So really specific information about the contents of this particular record. So next we'll talk about item level description. So in item level description, individual items in the collection are described. So some pros: extremely detailed information about collection contents. This is exceptionally easy for researchers and reference staff to use. As you might imagine, it's very time intensive and usually only applicable in cases of very small collections or exceptionally important collection material. So the Tilden papers actually have item level description as well. So if we go back to our slide here, if you click on one of these little icons here, it will bring up scanned records for all these letters. So, in a lot of ways, records that are digitized have item level description because you can look at the record and you can tell exactly what the content of the record is. So obviously to scan materials and to place them online, or to just describe the individual contents of every single letter and every single box, can be quite daunting and quite labor intensive. So one thing the MPLP really encourages archivists to do is to describe different collection material at different levels based on a few different factors. So the ones that the Green and Meisner article mentioned are the importance of the material and perceived current and future research use. And this is opposed to just describing everything at a fixed level, which may be more precise than a researcher needs or than the collection material really warrants. And MPLP also advocates describing particular parts of a collection differently from other parts of the collection. So if you have a collection and some parts of the collection document a really important event that a person was involved in, or a very important function that a corporation carried out, then you might describe that series or that sub-series at the folder or item level, whereas for the rest of the collection that doesn't describe things that are as important, you may just settle for box level. So even within collections, you can make judgments about how important the materials are, what level of description the materials warrant, and adjust your level of description accordingly. So when we discussed appraisal, we talked about functional analysis. This might be a good tool to use to understand the important functions of an organization. And if you've done your functional analysis and you know what the important activities of an organization were, then you can say, okay, well, we're really going to describe these materials at a thorough level, and we're not going to worry about the functions that we rated as being less important to the activities of an organization or less important to a person's life. So ideally, only collections that are important reflections of an archive's mission should be given complex description. So again, you really want to have your important materials, your useful materials described at a more in-depth level, just because you perceive that this information is going to be more useful and more used by researchers. And one example of this idea of kind of crossing the streams for you Ghostbusters fans is, again, if you look at the Tilden papers, only some of this collection has been digitized, so you can only access some of these materials online. Only some of these materials have item level description in the form of a digitized record. So if you are interested in the Council of the Corporation records, too bad, you have to access them from the archive. You can't do them from your home. If you're looking for records about Tilden's involvement with the New York State Assembly, too bad, you can't get those online. So for whatever reason, the New York Public Library decided that the correspondence, legal files, Democratic, Republican Party, and Free Soil Movement, and these other records that there are digitized records for are more important, and they deserve digitization, and they deserve to be more accessible for researchers. And of course, this comes at the cost of these other materials, for whatever reason, not being judged as being important enough for this type of mediation. So value judgments is something that we have talked about a lot in this class, and it really leads to the question of how do archivists decide which records receive more detailed description. So we've talked about looking at things like perceived future use and the quality or importance of the content, but there are a few other possible determinants that may lead archivists to describe records at one level as opposed to another. And it's really important that archivists think about why they're describing information at one level instead of another, because the more thoroughly things are described, the easier it's going to be for researchers to access them, and the more likely those records are going to be used. So if particular parts of a collection are used more than other parts of the collection, that can really skew the understanding of a person or an organization's activities. So if records just kind of glom onto one thing that a person does, then they may not talk as much about other aspects of a person or an organization. And that may result in only one part of a person or an organization's activities being written about and discussed and being more incorporated and represented in social memory. So these value judgments and these mediations that archivists do, again, really can have a strong impact on social memory, and really can lead archivists to, or lead researchers to seek out and use one collection or one part of a collection and not other collections or other parts of a collection. So it's really important that archivists really think about this question and are really transparent about why they chose to describe particular things at particular levels, and make the public aware of what those decisions were and why those decisions were made, because again, it really can have a strong impact in shaping how and how often researchers use records. So we talked about perceived future use. Again, this is one that I'm really kind of skeptical of. Archivists don't have a crystal ball. We don't know what is going to be important for researchers to use in the future, or what researchers are going to want to use in the future. This is one that's actually mentioned in the Wall article for this week. So the article talks about the Clifton papers, and although they were really difficult to process, they felt like there was going to be a lot of future use of them. So they kind of plowed through all that, and they provided a lot of description and access to those records anyway. So I guess if you know your community and you know who's using your repository, you know what the research interests of people who use your repository are, then maybe you can make this determination and attach describing records to a particular level to some perceived future use. But if you don't have that data and you don't have good data, then it can be kind of a guessing game, and it's not really a valid criteria to use. Another consideration is the volume of records. If a collection is huge, you're probably going to have difficulty describing it to the item level. It may lead you to describing some things to an item level and some things more generally. Quality of content and the quality of metadata attached to the content can be a huge determinant. And quality of content is something that the Wall article talks about also. So the archivists at Emory looked at how the files were used, the date range of the file. So does it document just a few years of a person's life or all of a person's life? The overall comprehensiveness of the records. Authenticity, is it a collection that doesn't have sort of mixed provenance, and the archivists are sure that it's just the records of one person and not possibly a couple of people, as was the case with one of the collections that the article mentions. And a key way to determine the quality of the content is to understand how the files were used by the records creators. This is something that the Wall article talks about when they discuss the sort of pre-steps to determining the level of access that a collection is going to receive. They talk about how it's just so important to do surveys and things like that to understand how the files were used and get other information. And so again, this really goes back to the need to work with donors and work with records creators to get that information. The Wall article is very emphatic about the importance of that and how that contributes to the quality of their description and their determinations about how they're going to describe their records. Quality of metadata, again, if there is metadata attached to records, that's going to make arrangement and description much easier, because you're going to already have information about records. You can kind of translate it into a finite, and you don't have to do research and recreate the wheel. So authenticity is something that I just touched on. If a collection is not authentic, then it may not have as much research value, and that may lead you to describe the records less thoroughly. Restrictions can be a big thing. So if the records contain a lot of material that might have copyright issues, or might have information contained in the records that is private, that may result in archivists not describing the materials as thoroughly because they kind of want to dissuade people from looking at and using those records. Or there just may be restrictions placed on the content and on the records by the donors. So obviously archivists aren't going to go to the trouble of thoroughly describing materials that may not be available for the next 50 years. And just overall, an archive should really consider how capable they are of describing records when they're determining how thoroughly to describe them. So if an archive doesn't think that it's really capable of describing records to a folder level, even in a small collection, then they probably shouldn't take that on and bite off more than they can chew, because that's going to result in a lot of resources going towards describing one collection that could be used to provide more general description and facilitate access to 5 or 6 other collections. So we talked about sustainability with appraisal and how every archive should carry out appraisal that is sort of within its means, and the same is true for arrangement and description as well. So to connect a little bit further arrangement and description to appraisal, especially these 3 things that I have highlighted here are all things that archivists can learn more about and have a greater understanding of if they do strong and involved appraisal of records. So you're going to know how many records are in a collection if you do good appraisal. You're going to have a better idea of the content of the records if you do appraisal. You're going to have a better idea of the metadata attached to records if you do quality appraisal. You could even lump in the level of authenticity as well. So there is a strong connection between arrangement and description and appraisal, and a lot of the work that you can do, as the Huth article from our appraisal discussion mentioned, can be translated into description. So if you spend the time and effort to get information about these things when you are appraising records, you can take the information that you have in your appraisal reports through your interviews and through your surveys and just plop that right into your FindAid, and it's going to save you a lot of time and a lot of effort. So again, this idea of appraisal as being the heart of archives and the most important thing that archives do, and how appraisal contributes to other archival activities, this is a prime example of that connection. So these different factors are going to be present to varying degrees from varying times. So, it may not always be the case that the volume of records influences the level of determination. It may not always be the case that restrictions are in place. It may not be that the authenticity of the records is going to be something that can influence how thoroughly records are described. But it's just really good to be aware of these different things that can serve as roadblocks for more in-depth description, and again, just doing whatever you can to make them less of an issue. If that means not accepting the collection because the quality of the content is low, or it has authenticity problems, or not accepting the collection because it has a lot of restrictions, then that can be a good strategy to take. If you as an archive find that you're not describing records to a thorough level because of these issues, then it really suggests that the deeper problem is that you're not doing appraisal as thoroughly as you should. You should know if the quality of the content of the records that you're getting is bad. You should know if you're getting a ton of records that you're never going to be able to describe very thoroughly because you just don't have the resources to do it. You should know ahead of time if there are going to be a bunch of restrictions that are going to prevent you or deter you from describing records thoroughly. So if you get to the point where you're just having to provide or choosing to provide really basic information or really basic description to records, then that really suggests that you're bringing into your archive a lot of collections that don't have a lot of value and don't really have a lot of utility for researchers, or you're simply bringing in collections that you don't really have the ability to take good care of. And that's just a waste of time, it's a waste of resources, and it's going to result in a lot of collections being made available to researchers that don't really have a lot of value or a lot of purpose or a research value to them. So to talk a little bit more about the digital archive processing at Emory University, they were trying to find a processing process that was scalable and adaptable, so one that could adjust to collections that were really large and also collections that were fairly small, one that really did describe the levels of description that a collection would receive, describe the level of researcher access, which is something that we'll talk more about later on, and that really was focused on the efficient use of processing resources. So archives don't have infinite resources. They may need to make choices to prioritize certain records over others. And so this article was really focused on how Emory University's archives focus on making those decisions. So when you talk about digital archives, this is obviously a response to the changing nature of records. When you look at the change to electronic and digital records, scalable and adaptable, this speaks to the vast amount of records that are being produced and the vast amount of records are being out there, and how do you translate that into digital archives processing that is actually within the means of a repository. So just within this article, you can see reflections of a few of the different factors that have influenced the evolution of the archival profession, which of course is one of our course learning objectives. So to wrap things up by looking at some of the criteria that the Emory University Archive used when determining the descriptive levels and the access levels of their digital archives. So again, they looked at the quality of data, looking at totality, scope, and viability, the authenticity of the data, so making sure that the donor created, used, and managed the files that are in their collection, looking at some restrictions, so either by copyright or placed on by the donor, and again, looking at the potential use. And taking these criteria, looking at the overall amount of effort it would take to process the records, and using that as a determination for the level of access and description. So again, as I mentioned before, the article has an example of the Clifton article where the collection did have a lot of weird formats, and it was a lot of effort to provide access to those records, and it did involve a lot of processing, but those records were still given optimum access because the archivist at Emory University thought that the collection was important enough and that it would be used enough to warrant this additional effort. And they talked about how low value collections may still receive a standard access level even if they're easy to process. So again, it just all goes back to this idea of weighing the overall content of records, getting an idea of the amount of effort that it will take to process them, and then using that as a framework for your descriptive choices. And what I really like about this article is it does kind of pull back the hood, and it does give readers some information about what the decision-making process was when these archivists were determining how thoroughly collections would be described and what kind of access researchers would have to them. So this goes back to the transparency that I talked about before, which really is an important thing for archivists to think about in providing information like this to researchers. In some ways, I'm not really sure that this is an objective set of criteria to have, and it's probably inevitable that some bias or some subjectivity is going to creep into this decision-making process, even if it is, sort of written out and articulated, how do you decide what processing effort is too much? How do you decide what is the potential use of a collection? But it is a really good step towards objectivity and transparency, and it really is interesting to see kind of the decision-making process behind processing these different collections. And we'll talk more about access next week, so we'll kind of continue our discussion when we do that. Okay, so that is an overview of arrangement and description. I hope you learn more about what arrangement and description is, what it seeks to accomplish, how archivists make choices about differing levels of arrangement and description, and what types of collections are going to receive those levels of arrangement and description, and how differing levels of arrangement and description can impact researchers and social memory. So again, we'll touch on some of these issues next week when we discuss access, because that is closely tied to description and the creation of descriptive tools. So to be continued, we'll also talk about privacy and some of the ethical issues that arrangement and description might be related to. We'll talk about MPLP more when we talk about preservation. So some of the things that we touched on in this lecture will be re-examined a little bit as we move through the semester and as we talk about different topics. So thank you for listening. As always, please let me know if you have any questions, and have a great week.